G'day, my name's Darren Doherty. I'm from Bendigo in southern Australia, Victoria, southern Australia. And what we wanted to do today was to do a landscape modelling exercise where we demonstrated Keyline Design and also brought elements of broadacre permaculture. So Keyline is a design system that was developed by PA Yeomans in Australia in the 1940s and 50s. It's a design system that focuses on water harvesting of dryland landscapes, harvesting rainwater off dryland landscape surfaces, and then storing that in ponds which are largely interconnected, and which are then used in the dry months for irrigation purposes around the farm by gravity. Yeomans also developed a system of soil renovation where using a rigid tined non-inversion plough would actually aerate the soil and then use grazing animals to harvest the extra growth that one got from these plants having deeper root systems from uncompacted soil, and then use the grazing animals to harvest that grass and then increase the amount of root depth in the soil, which would increase the amount of carbon build-up in soil from the roots decomposition. Doing that over a succession of years enabled him to build up to 15, 20 inches of deep, rich topsoil. It's a very, very effective system, low cost, gravity, and will last pretty well forever if it's well maintained. It's a classic regenerative permaculture system. So what we might first do is look at this landscape here that we've created. Now, we're on a beach because that's nice and easy to excavate, and also just shows us a sort of a microcosm of our whole landscape from mountain to sea. So you could look at this as well as being part of the hydrological cycle. We start with this sort of classic form of mountains and then hills that come off the mountains. We've got the valley system, which is creek, then coming into, so creek off the hills, then coming down into this drain, into the river, running out through, this might be the Mississippi for example, running out through the through some hills and lower ranges, often in an arid zone, because none of the water that's going through this river is actually being sourced from this floodplain. It's all being sourced from the higher country here, right? So it comes down through here and then fans out again, basically out into like a delta, and then that ends up being in the sea itself. So right here would be, the Mississippi Delta, okay? And only we haven't put in any levees here. It's actually operating like it should. It's a beautiful spreading system that's depositing all of its material and doing so and dispersing all of its energy of flow. Just like in our body and in trees, we have 7 orders of drainage. Now, the first orders of drainage we can actually see happening just with the sand falling off that little piece there. That's called the sheet flow. So this is rain falling. There's the sheet flow. Then the sheet flow comes into starts to form into little rills. Now, so we've got the first order of flow, which is sheet. Second order of flow is the rill. Third order is when it comes into the runnel. The runnel concentrates right here at a point in the valley called a primary valley, which is PA Yeomans called the key point of the valley. And you can see that quite clearly here, that the landform here is obviously convex, and then it comes down into being concave. We can just move the sand there and it will always go to that point.
And it just settles there?
Well, it sits there for a minute. The water will actually sit there for a minute. You'll get some residence time, and often what you'll get, that'll be the first place in the landscape where you might get a bit of soil deposition, and where the soil deepens, and you might get a bit of a green spot there for some time. Often what you'll find is right at those points in the landscape, that, like around here, there'll be an oak tree, because the oak's got enough water there to invest in that place. So we get to there. Now, then from that order, then it comes down into the creek, and then the creek, 4th order, 5th order river, 6th order delta, 7th order the blue stuff, the ocean. So our heart's like the sea or the ocean, right? So that branching will go out, and the same with if you've got a tree. A tree will have up in its branches, it'll have all of those 7 orders going through to the sea, the trunk being the river, right? And then going back out through where the seed germinated back out into the root system, which has the same 7 orders, the dendritic pattern. You cannot have any more than 7 orders, and it doesn't just, that's totally replicated through all of nature, mycelium, everything. It is incredible, yeah. All right, so what we want to do here is, I'll just go through those landscape identifications for us again. Is that, say that, Yeomans looked at this and said, all right, well, this is the horizon of the landscape. We're standing down here as a little bitty person looking up, and all we can see is the horizon of the landscape. You've got it all around us here. When we look back at the ranges there, you can see that that's our horizon, the main ridge. Now, like you said before, that's like the top of the watershed. Water is either falling this way or it's falling that way, right? It will all end up in this river system though, right? So that's what he called the main ridge. Now, the next part of it was right here, which is known as the saddle for obvious reasons. Now, we have a succession of saddles in this landscape, hill to saddle or mountain to saddle. Then we go down into here, and we have a succession of ridges and valleys called the primary ridges, primary valleys. Primary ridge, primary valley. And there's a succession of those off the main ridge. Think of it in terms of the roof of a house. You have the roof like so, the gable, you have the ridge capping, which you could say is the main ridge. Then off that, you've got all of the corrugations. Primary ridge, primary valley, primary ridge, primary valley, exactly the same. And then it comes down into a gutter. I do this in my courses where I say, all right, well, here's your mountain ranges, and you've got a saddle in between, and then you've got these successions of main ridges, primary ridges and primary valleys, each one with a little key point where the land shape in the webbing there, right where it goes to being webbing, changes from being convex to concave. Yeah, we've got other points in our human landscape. The beach is a good place to illustrate them. I might do one here right now, where we, if we lie back, say I had my budgie smuggler, as we call them at home, my togs, or thong, I think you call them here. I'd be coming down in a bit of a join like that, or like a bikini. I've got a primary ridge here, and all of the water will actually end up in here. So if I poured water on my belly right here, it would end up in here, right? So if we've got a bit of bigger belly than what might end up with one day. Now the other place is right here on your chest. That's ostensibly like your hills here, and then you've got the sternum, right? So if you go for a swim in the beach, you'll and come back and lie down, even your sweat will actually gravitate to that point. Now that's what these saddles are. So these patterns continue to replicate in the landscape, yeah, which is pretty interesting, yeah. At the moment, this is a watershed. There is no water actually being held in here, and at the moment, we've had Europeans come through in the last 400 years and have removed all of the vegetation. There's just a few little scraps left behind here and there. And we've had a few hundred years of grazing, and basically all taking with no giving. Now, that's important. What's important to look at from that perspective is that we're declining in the amount of fertility that we have down here. Now, the primary reason why we're declining in that fertility is because we've removed all of the source, the original source of fertility, which is up on the hills. We've taken the forests away. We don't have any pathways for the full amount of nutrient that goes out to the sea to actually come back again. And now the erosion that we have off the hills doesn't have anything in it except for silt. It's inorganic material, right? So it's just not that much value to us. In the old days, that's all forested, all of the animals are up there, etc., and all of the nutrient flows down, and then that deposits down in the creeks and ultimately out into the delta, into the mangroves, etc. In the colder environments, what we'd have is, and even down here, we'd have salmon coming back up in here. So, which are just, one of the reasons why they're such a good thing to eat is they're just so packed full of nutrient. Yeah. Now they come back up here to die, to spawn and die. So they've done tests, isotopic tests on vegetation and in soils in some hills where the system is still intact, and some enormous percentage of the nutrient is actually from salmon. Right? From having the salmon run back up here, a bear or a bird coming down and eating the carcass or whatever, then scurrying back up into the hills, depositing either their nutrient or themselves. They die up there too. So you've got that very, very elegant, timeless cycle of nature that's existing, and that exists all over the world. And what's also existing all over the world is humans removing all of that. And also doing this. Finding places like here and putting in a big block, right? Now that makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for those runs of fish to come back up the rivers and continue what is a very sustainable regenerative system, right? So what these also do is they often have the pipe going through the bottom for the hydroelectric, very deep water, very cold, adjust the whole temperature of the system as well. In Australia, we spend a lot of time with our land care movement and in permaculture, etc., trying to restore this whole system so that, because we understand that that's where the true sustainability or source of sustainability in all of our landscape, human and animal, comes from, is from the maintenance of our watersheds. They are just so critical, it's not funny, Yeah. So let's get rid of that. The other thing about these storages down below is that they've basically lost all of the energy. They're way down low. It's it's any wonder that those systems where they are placed, they only have the capacity. They'll typically put that and then they'll put a drain out here, like a weir, and that'll then go off and irrigate deserts. Right? So when we go off and irrigate desert, there's no desert irrigation that humans have done in our whole history or prehistory that's ended up being not sustainable or having not collapsed. Each one of these hills is successively lower than the other. That's fairly typical in all global landscapes, that you'll have a high point, which is often at the top of this sort of idealized horseshoe landscape. That will typically be the highest point. And then the ridges off that will typically be successively lower. Accordingly, each of these saddles will be successively lower, and each of the key points of the landscape will be successively lower. Now, P.A. Yeomans observed this and basically determined that what we could do is if we built a pond in here, using that key point of the landscape as the water level, each one of these ponds could actually run from one to the other because each one of these key points is lower from one to the other. So we build our little pond in there, which in real scale might be anything from, 3 to 30 acre feet of water. I've got a bit of an erosion problem on this slope. But look, it's not going anywhere. It's being caught in my drain. Right, so that's running from there to there just by a gravity flow. And then this one will run around to this one. That's what Yeomans noticed, and that's what he built in his Keyline system, that he could basically cascade from key point to key point all of these ponds. So what Yeomans decided was that if we're going to invest the money in building these ponds, well, then we should use them. And so what he did was put a pipe in the bottom of these ponds, and which we could just do with this bit of stick here. Oops. And then run that water out in a little channel with about a 1 in 400 fall. So that's about 6 inches every 50 yards. Run that water out, it's like so. And then that would be able to, then he'd block that along the way as it flows out. And then that would actually run over the surface like so, in either direction that you chose. That would enable one to flood irrigate foothills. Now, by doing that, you radically increase production. And also, you're not flooding deserts, you're not flooding flatlands, all of those sorts of things. You tend up in these landscapes to have a bit more of a humid environment. So in doing all of that, he then determined, well, I've actually got excess water running off here. And you might own, all of this here. All right, so the creek is his boundary, let's say. He owns, this is Yeomans block, all right? Now, so what he decided then was to put another pond at the end of these drains. And again, put a pipe in the bottom of it. And then that pipe would then allow you to irrigate another section down here. What is now ostensibly your creek flat. So now you've increased your production radically, and you haven't had to buy any more land, which sort of fits in well with what we're talking about in permaculture, where we're trying to make the best use of what we've got as opposed to going out and taking on more area, which becomes more difficult for us to manage. Now, there's another point in the landscape, as I alluded to before, where we could do this, where we could do the water catchment, but it's not always possible, and that is in the saddle of the landscape. So in this point here, we mark where our key point is, and we could potentially build a pond right in there. Now, typically you'd say, well, that's not going to get any water to that because there's only a small amount of catchment area, very small actually, catchment area that's coming to that. So we have to increase that. Now, there's two ways that can happen. One is that we can have a road along our ridge, which is typically a place where we would put our roads, like a skyline road. Another way is that we might actually put some drains around the slope that bring the water to here. Provided, of course, it's not too steep. I mean, this is not a pond, not a situation that we'd be able to do in it everywhere, because often the saddles are too steep or the surrounding hills are too steep or whatever. So you'll just have to look at that. Key points are the same. Not every key point in the landscape is really a possible pond site because some are too small, or you mightn't have enough catchment to bring the water in from elsewhere. You've only so there's lots of investigation that one would need to do. So if we were to put, say we had that road along here, that road's going to come, and then I would have it actually run across the wall of the pond. Now, the good thing about roads are that they're 60 to 90% of the water that falls on a road will actually run off. Only about, on a landscape, you'll only get 5 to 20% of the water that hits the landscape will run off. With the exception of when you've got these things. When you've got rocks are, particularly in a dryland landscape, are very, very useful to you in order to be able to harvest water and use them as a, yeah, you can. You can, like for this one here, we could put a little channel around the base of that one and bring it into there, right? So we'd catch the amount of water that was falling off the back, bring it around to here, then that would run down the gutter of the road and into this pond. We could then put a pipe in the bottom of this one or a siphon over the top, and then that, let's assume that this is all a nice slope that's, say, less than 30 degrees. Then we could traverse that slope quite safely with livestock, right? And so that then would provide all of the water that we'd need for the livestock, either for irrigation or for drinking water. So you'd be able to gravity feed all of your stock troughs. Now, the other part of this is, like I said, we need to forest our hills. So what we could do here is a few different treatments for reforesting these hills. Now, one would be to, reforest the whole thing with a sort of a closed revegetation. That's one option. The other option is, which might be palatable to a lot more ranchers, is to do something more like a wide-spaced forestry. So got a few trees. They've just been through a fire, so we could... So with these trees here, what we do is actually have them at sort of more wide spacing. A good 20 yards or something like that. So it's actually mimicking a open woodland sort of system. We could put them up there like so. Now, even in this micro landscape, you can already see that these deciduous trees, as they are, or burnt trees, are casting a little bit of shade, which is a good thing. It's nothing like having plenty of shade. It's something that a lot of the livestock in dryland or semi-arid zones suffer from, is an amount of exposure, just as they do in more cool, humid landscapes. So we get a few of those sorts of trees put up there, then that works quite well. And that will start to create a good open woodland and give us some trees so that we've got some shelter. Now what we can also do is we can select those trees, select the species of those trees so that they actually have some additional yields. So they might be species that give us timber for fencing. Grazing properties in particular have very high fencing timber needs, right? And I don't see anywhere that anybody is growing any timber dedicated for on-farm use. It's always having to come from somewhere. And it all comes off the bottom line, right? So that's something on our farm at home. We had 4 different lots of different ages. So anytime we needed to go do fencing, well, it wasn't a matter of paying $60 a post. It was a matter of just going out with a chainsaw and spending some time. So we can use those timbers for fencing. We also might want to select species that have a durable timber but also drop a pod or a seed or a fruit that's actually feed for the animals themselves, for the livestock themselves. So species like honey locusts, for example, an American species, works very well. Even fruit trees are quite good. And you've got a whole host of other fodder trees. Even your own oak trees are excellent. Oak trees produce acorns, which are high carbohydrate, small amount of protein, but high carbohydrate. Now they're falling at a time of year when there's no other feed. You know, you look around at these hills at the moment, there's no feed. Everybody is providing supplementary feed. So that's one thing that we could do. Another thing that we could do is be a bit tighter with the spacings and just put it into dedicated timber growing forestry system, where you're only doing a sort of very ephemeral grazing, maybe once a year, as opposed to more often in this wide space system. So there's a range of options there. I think it's something that people here in California and in the US at large need to develop a culture of tree farming and integrate the trees into their grazing or other agricultural systems so that they can get the benefits that trees bring in moderating climate, providing shade, increasing shelter, etc. Well, and saving your money when you have to buy. And timber is a declining resource around the planet. And obviously it does a good job from the carbon perspective as well. All right, so we'll come back down into our completed landscape here from a keyline perspective. And what we might want to do here is also find the best places to put trees in. So we might look at this slope. Any slope is a good place to put trees from the perspective, especially where you've got any potential for landslip, and just to intercept the rain, intercept the wind, etc. We can put those across the slope on a bit of a contour or something. While different trees have different root systems, and I would always be looking, as a permaculturalist, I would always be looking at species that have multiple purposes, multiple yields. So those species that I mentioned before would be ideal. But if you felt that you had enough of those, you could always put those trees in and put in some timber trees or whatever else that were a bit more specific in their yield. This is what's called a diversion drain that runs from this dam to this dam. This here was the irrigation drain that's irrigating all of this area here, right? What we could do with this is in between here we could put in what's called a contour strip forest, as per Yeomans, because it's only during heavier rainfall that we actually get this actually running, or when this dam overflows and then it flows to this one here. So the rest of the time it would act something similar to a swale. Now a swale is a level, uncompacted ditch on contour. This has got a slight grade to it. It's only, 1 yard every 400 yards, so it's barely discernible as having a grade. It is so gentle. So it's only when we get a bigger rainfall event that it'll actually run. The rest of the time the water will actually settle in there and infiltrate into to feed these trees. So it's a very, very good irrigation system. Yeah. That works extremely well. Now again, these could be timber trees. They could be, as we call them, tree crops, species that have multiple yields. It could even be an orchard that you put in there. So we've got that now. Here's our irrigation through here. What we can do now is, like I said, we can catch that excess irrigation, bring it down into the next pond, which then irrigates along here again. Now, from that is another place in between where we put our trees. So now we're starting to get something like a bit of terracing in this landscape, with the terraces being divided by these trees. Now that's fantastic, I think. We've got a balance of sheltered pasture, of say wide-spaced agroforestry or tree crops. We've got irrigated pasture or crop. That really enlivens a whole range of options. We've got these slopes on some properties that are quite stable enough to be able to graze, only made more stable by putting trees into them. And we've got levels of shelter, sort of almost the tops of the trees are actually coming from one into the other. So we're getting, if this is our prevailing wind direction, we're getting lots and lots of shelter on the system. It's one of the things with these kinds of developments is the more intensive the land system, the more livings that there can be extracted from this, because it can actually start to be quite a people-intensive system. And that's where, you know, some of our agricultural land or planning laws need to sort of understand that potential. That if we want to recover our landscapes from the decimation that they've had over time, then we need to actually bring people back out into the landscapes and allow that to happen. At the moment, you know, the planning laws really make it difficult for us to bring people back into the landscape unless they're ostensibly wage slaves. So who have no connect, as opposed to, you know, they're there as a dependent trying to get a check. Yeah. So yeah, this is pretty easy stuff. Not that big an investment. Incremental in the way that it can be developed. You know, if I was going to develop it, I'd concentrate on building one here first so that I could work on my better parts of land first, because you can get the greatest possible effect for the least possible change. You know, once we get down into these landscapes, we've got deeper soil, better soil. The only thing that's often missing is water. Now, some people will get the water from underground. Now, that underground water could be very, very old indeed, and you know, is a declining resource wherever we go. We were over in the Kiama River Valley, and they're down to over 1,000 feet in a lot of locations now. So that is not sustainable, obviously. Well, that is your water. In fact, this state is going to need to look at very seriously its water situation, particularly in how it respects rainwater. To not allow you to get a permit to build a dwelling or to live in a dwelling without having a well is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard in my life, especially coming from a nation of rainwater harvesters, where on every house in rural Australia we have a rainwater tank which harvests water off the roof. For one, as my friends had to do, they had to spend $25,000 building a well 400 feet deep that's going to require energy to continue to lift that out. So fossil energy to continue to pump that water out. It's got lots of dissolved solids. It's not exactly fantastic water. And then they've got to spend about another $6,000 plumbing it into their house, as opposed to spending about $5,000 on building a rainwater tank, and they would have all of the potable water that they needed. And you know, if they were concerned about the potability of that water, well, then it's just a matter of putting some filtration on it. There's more than enough carbon filters, UV filters. We have all of the technology that we need in order to make rainwater, even polluted rainwater, very safe and potable. There's the potential as well especially in horticultural areas, for groundwater pollution from mobile pesticides and herbicides, etc. I believe that in Florida, that one of the main groundwater pollutants is a herbicide called simazine. Now, simazine is used as a pre-emergent herbicide, so it locks onto clay particles in the soil and then it prevents the germination of seeds, sprouting of seeds that might compete with your crop, as an antidote to having to continue to use a knockdown herbicide like glyphosate or Roundup as it's better known. Now, that herbicide is only effective if there's clay in the soil where it can actually lodge on. If there's none of that, as with a lot of our horticultural areas, which are sandy loam soils from the deposition of sandstone hills and limestone hills, etc., we have sandy loam over clay, or just deep sands, and obviously there's nothing to hold on to that, and it becomes mobile, gets into the groundwater. So I mean, to me, I think that the best thing that we can do with groundwater is actually leave it alone. It's a well overused resource in this country, and rainwater is a radically underutilised resource in this country. Every house should have a rainwater tank. You can do things like this. You can also do things like keyline ploughing. If we weren't allowed to build any of these ponds, which is quite possible, I think we're still allowed to plant trees, and I think we're still allowed to cultivate. So just by using something like a Yeomans Keyline plough or its analogues, we can basically work the ground on a slightly falling contour, like fall out towards the ridge from the valley, and enable therefore the water that falls to infiltrate into the ground, or when it's really heavy, to actually move away from the valley out towards the ridge, therefore rehydrating the ridges. So that's another very powerful thing that we can do. This that we see here had its infancy about nearly 60 years ago. So we've got systems in Australia that have been going for, 50 odd years. My family farm had this system until the family farm was sold in 2002. The system was built in the 1950s and worked perfectly well, all by gravity, all by rainfall. And it meant that we didn't need to get a farm that was bigger. And we had options. And we were drought proof, and we were fireproof, because that's the other reason why Yeomans developed this system. In 1943, his brother-in-law was killed by a bushfire, so that stimulated, the need to drought proof his landscape was one thing. The other thing was that he could, with all of these ponds, in the event of a fire, just open the valves and flood his whole landscape. And in doing so, removed any potential for fire at all. California, South Africa, southeastern Australia, southwestern Australia are all the most fire-prone parts of the world. Oh, and Provence, Spain, Mediterranean climates, those brittle climates. So there's no reason in any of those places where we couldn't do this kind of thing. Yeah. And then, because most of these foothills are where the humans are habitating, it's only up into the mountains where we find it difficult to build these kinds of systems, and nor we should. And fire might be part of a natural regime there anyway. So, but at least in our valuable areas where humans are habitating, fire is something that we can prevent. From the very point of putting in tree belts which are non-flammable, from pruning our trees so that we have clean stems which are not flammable or not as flammable, from us harvesting or mulching the residue of our prunings from trees so that they are not so flammable. From selecting species that don't have flammable leaves. There's a whole range of different strategies. And then we put on another layer of that if we are irrigating pastures through summer, then they are going to be green and they don't burn. So we have layers of ameliorative strategies to overcome fire.